My presentation is about history and overview of international guidelines in research ethics. The objective of this PowerPoint presentation is to describe, appreciate, and explain the evolution of international guidelines in research ethics. I'm going to follow the following outline. I talk about the early clinical trials, and then the research ethics guidelines, which starts from the Nuremberg Code, and then the framing of the Belmont Report, the Declaration of Helsinki, the 2013 version, the ICH-GCP revisions, and the SIOMS guidelines. Please take note that research ethics has a very recent history. As shown by my outline, the different research ethics guidelines only came about after the Second World War, when the Nazi scientists were tried for crimes against humanity. And therefore, there was the Nuremberg trial, and the Nuremberg trial came out with the Nuremberg Code, which defines the provisions of research ethics as different from the ethics of clinical care. So that's what I'm going to discuss in my presentation. During the early period, as early as 1796 in England, you know very well that the vaccines were developed. And here you would have Edward Jenner, who injects healthy James Phipps, who was 8 years old then, first with cowpox, then 3 months later with smallpox, and later discovered the smallpox vaccine. During this time, there were no guidelines to talk about ethics in research, and therefore, the doctors would simply use their patients as experimental subjects. In the 1900s in Cuba, you will have Major Walter Reed of the U.S. Army injecting 22 Spanish immigrant workers in Cuba with the agent for yellow fever, paying them $100 if they survive and $200 if they contract the disease. So, this was an example of American experimentation by the US military. In the Philippines, here at home, you would have Harvard professors becoming the faculty members of the University of the Philippines College of Medicine, which was established during the American period. And as part of their research, you would have Dr. Richard Strong, who was a professor of tropical medicine at Harvard and also a professor at the University of the Philippines College of Medicine, experimenting with cholera on prisoners on the death row. And as a result, he killed 13 people. Of course, the prisoners are classified as vulnerable participants since they cannot say no to the doctor who was doing an experiment on them. During the Second World War, you would have the famous prison of Auschwitz, where you will have the Jews being kept as prisoners by the Nazis on the order of Hitler. And here, the famous Nazi scientist was Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was known as the Angel of Death. And he performed many experiments on children, injecting them with chemicals, and also experiments on prisoners with deformities, making them undergo brutal surgeries and amputations, and experimenting on female prisoners by making use of sterility pills and shockwave treatments in order to find out what was going to happen to them. The Nazi scientists were using different kinds of prisoners for different types of experimentation. And they were hoping that whatever information and scientific knowledge they are able to derive from these experiments would be used by the Nazi military in order to win the war. And as a result, after the Second World War, you would have the Nuremberg Code, Nuremberg trials taking place where the Nazi military were tried for crimes against humanity at the same time that it also tried the Nazi scientists for the different experiments that they did on the prisoners. So here you'd have a picture of Justice Robert Jackson, and he says, "Let Nuremberg stand as a warning to all who plan and wage aggressive wars." The Nuremberg Code, therefore, were principles resulting from the Nuremberg trials, and 23 leading German physicians and administrators were tried for conspiracy, war crimes against humanity, and membership in criminal organizations. And 16 of them were sentenced to either death by hanging or imprisonment, and 7 were acquitted. This led to the adoption of the Nuremberg Code, which was the first code of ethics about research. And here you will have 10 principles, 10 provisions that would define the human rights of subjects who were recruited into human experiment studies. Number one, voluntary consent of the human subject must be taken, and that voluntary consent for research must be different from the consent for clinical care. Second, experiment should result for the good of society. So you just cannot be very whimsical and do any experiment that you want. Third, experiment on humans should be based on animal experimentation. In other words, you do your experiments on animals first to see if it will do them some good or to see whether it will cause harm, and the data will be used in order to determine the safety on human participants later on. Number four, experiment should avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury, which means that the researcher must evaluate the risk of any kind of human experimentation and try to minimize them. At the same time, that it is the duty of the ethics committee to avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering or injury that could accrue to the subjects. Number five, experiment should not be done if it will cause death or disability. Number six, risk must not exceed the humanitarian importance of the research. And seven, proper preparations and adequate facilities should be provided whenever doing any human subject experimentation. Number eight, the experiment should be done only by qualified persons. For example, me, I'm a social scientist. I'm not supposed to do a clinical trial. 9. Subjects should be free to end participation. This is the element of voluntariness and informed consent, that at any time that you want to withdraw from the study, then you have the freedom to do so. And number 10, the scientist must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if needed. Suppose the experiment would cause in some death and may not yield fruitful results, then at any point it has to be terminated. So, what was the impact of the Nuremberg Code? You have the UNHCR saying it is the basic human right not to be a subject of experimentation against one's will or without one's free consent. So, it mandated a separate consent form when you are participating in health or human experimental research. The Declaration of the Geneva likewise condemned the Nazi experiments, and the Geneva Conventions provided protection against unwanted biological or medical experimentation. All of this happened in Europe, but in the United States, there were parallel developments related to human experimentation that happened from 1932 to 1972, where in Alabama, in USA, you would have the Tuskegee to syphilis experiment. And this was done by the U.S. Public Health Service on untreated syphilis. They wanted to know how syphilis kills and spreads, how syphilis affects black people compared to whites, and there were 399 illiterate black men who were told that they had bad blood and would receive free treatment, transportation, meals, and burial. And from them, researchers planned to get data from their autopsies. In other words, the design of this particular study was observational in character. They wanted to see how syphilis evolved from the time a patient would be infected with syphilis until he dies. And the design would not allow any kind of intervention during the course of the experiment. That's why it was very long, from 1932 to 1972. So, what happened? By 1947, penicillin already became the standard treatment for syphilis, but subjects were not given treatment and they were prevented from getting information. Remember, they were told that it was just a matter of bad blood. They would not even call it syphilis. So, there was some kind of willful non disclosure so that you will be able to reach the end point, and the end point of the experiment was death. In 1972, this was exposed by the media, and therefore it resulted in a congressional investigation that found out that the black men in Tuskegee were not fairly treated. And therefore, you would have all the anomalies related to human experimentation being exposed. And in 1997, much later on, President Clinton issued an apology to the victims of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment study. This led to the adoption of the Belmont Report, which are ethical principles and guidelines for the protection of human subjects in research. This was prepared by the U.S. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, and it was adopted on April 18, 1979. The convening of the U.S. National Commission was intended to investigate about what happened during the syphilis Tuskegee experiment and to come up with the basic ethical principles which should be adopted when doing human research experimentation. These were philosophers who sat together and who came up with the three basic ethical principles that would have to be followed when doing human experimentation. First was the principle of autonomy or respect for persons, and the implication of that was there has to be informed consent before participating in any study, and the doctor, the researcher, or the physician must respect the decision of that person whether he is giving consent or not to participate in a human study. The second principle is the principle of beneficence or do not do harm. Doctors are familiar with the principle of beneficence since when they take the Hippocratic Oath, they promise that they will not do harm to their patients and to their human subjects. So, research should not do harm to participants who are recruited to join a specific study. And the third principle was the principle of justice. What do you get? What do you deserve by participating in a human research study? Justice demands that there has to be some benefit to the participants who are recruited into the study, or at least there has to be some benefits to society as a result of human experimentation. So, in many of the cases that are being taken up for analysis related to research ethics, these three principles have become the guiding principles, and they are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Again, back in Europe, you would have other organizations taking issue with health or medicinal research. And here you would have the initiative of the World Medical Association, which is an association of all medical societies in different countries all over the world. They came up in 1964 with the so called Declaration of Helsinki, and it is entitled Ethical Principles for Medical Research Involving Human Subjects. It was a guidance for doctors doing research on their patients, and they were adapted from the provisions of the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code was a juridical document, and the doctors felt that they needed a separate document, a set of principles which will guide doctors when doing research. Research as different from doing clinical care. So, the Declaration of Helsinki has become a morally binding obligation for physicians, and they should override national laws or legislation, and it became a higher standard. The original rationale was that there was no international statement on human experimentation and there were limited laws, and therefore it was necessary to have a document to guide doctors, and it expanded the 10 provisions of the Nuremberg Code. It became the basic text for other international guidelines, such as CIOMS, that's the Council of the International Organization for Medical Sciences, as well as the WHO guidelines for good clinical practice for trials. And later on, that became the ICH GCP guideline, which was adapted also in Europe, and you would have Council of Europe statements that would also echo the provisions of the Declaration of Helsinki, and it became adapted by several national guidelines worldwide, and it has been amended regularly from 1964, and the latest version is the 2013 version. And the Secretariat of the Declaration of Helsinki Committee of the World Medical Association said that they should always follow the latest version of the declaration in 2013. So, what are the guidelines as defined by the Declaration of Helsinki? Earlier, we said these are guidelines for medical doctors conducting research. And first and foremost, they want to differentiate between therapy and research. When you are involved in clinical care, you are doing therapy and you give your patients the best intervention, the best medicine that is currently available. As different from research, because in research, your treatment of your patients is dominated by a protocol, a research protocol that has objectives, that would have methods, and the methods will specify what procedures you're going to follow when doing research. In other words, the objective of research is not really to treat your patient. That becomes a secondary objective. The main objective of research is to be able to prove your hypothesis. You are using an experimental drug and you want to know whether it is safe and efficacious for a specific type of disease. And you are using this drug maybe in comparison with placebo or in comparison with a controlled drug. And the other drugs are not available in your experiment. And therefore, in informed consent, in many of these clinical trials, you say there are alternative treatments that are not available. If you participate in this research, you are free to withdraw anytime. So, that is the difference between therapy and research as objectives of your activity. Then, the Declaration of Helsinki also mandated that there has to be an independent committee that's going to review your protocol before you are able to implement it. And that independent committee evolved as the Research Ethics Committee. And it has now become an international guideline that when you are doing research, your protocol has to be evaluated by a research ethics committee. So, it is not just a bureaucratic requirement, it is mandated by international guidelines. The Nuremberg Code did not contain any provision for an independent committee. So, the Research Ethics Committee was an innovation that was started in the Declaration of Helsinki. Then there is the element of informed consent. Take note, it has to be informed, meaning you disclose all the issues that are relevant to the participant before he makes a decision to participate in your research. And therefore, the contents of the informed consent has to be truthful, it has to be complete, it has to be comprehensive to enable a participant to decide whether he will join a study or not. The next provision is about the qualifications of the researchers. They must be medically and scientifically qualified. So, if this is a treatment study, you need medical doctors to become your researchers, and an ethics committee is going to assess the training, the experience, the degree of the researcher. That's very important job of an ethics committee. At the same time, Risk should not exceed the benefits. In other words, even if this is a very important study, it is never justified that the end point is going to be death. You have to look at the risk and the benefits, and there has to be a favorable benefit risk ratio. So, this became guidelines for medical doctors conducting research. Later on, there were additions that were added to the Declaration of Helsinki in 2008. It was expanded to include human research that makes use of human data or material. At the beginning, it was only intended for clinical trials, but take note now that the 2008 version says that the declaration would also include the use of human data or material. What is an example of a research making use of human data? Researches that make use of medical records. They have to be evaluated by the ethics committee because that is human data. Or material, pathology samples that are being used for research would also have to undergo assessment by an ethics committee. So, it should include not only clinical trials but maybe observational and laboratory researches as well. Then it says it should also include the review of biomedical and behavioral research. Behavioral research being used for health protocols would have to undergo ethics committees. Example of this would be quality of life studies, no? Or behavior of patients related to a specific type of disease that is now under the coverage of the Declaration of Helsinki. And the sections of the protocol were also modified so that it was now mandatory that there is an ethical consideration section in the protocol where the researcher is going to explain how the ethical issues are going to be addressed in the conduct of a protocol. The next point is about the use of placebo, that it has to be justified. It did not say prohibit the use of a placebo, but the use of placebo should be justified, meaning you justify why you are withholding treatment to your placebo group or to your control group. And no one should be deprived of the standard of care when participating in human clinical trials. And the next point is provide some form of post trial access to successful products. Suppose that after your study, you are able to prove that this new drug works in cancer. What is going to be the benefit of participants who were recruited into the study to come up with a good conclusion? So post-trial access becomes the issue. Should they have access to the new drug that was developed with their participation? Should they have access to information about their disease? These are the types of post-trial access that's mandated by the Declaration of Helsinki. The 2013 version was further improved, and it talks about the strengthening and empowering of the research ethics committees. But at the same time, it says that the research ethics committee should be qualified, independent, and transparent. Qualification means that members of ethics committee should also undergo training, and they should adopt independent decisions, and they should be transparent in their deliberations. The review of the protocol should be done before the study begins. The protocol must be compliant with national and international norms, and that is the function of the ethics committee to check whether it is compliant enough. And there is a right to monitor ongoing studies. No amendment can be introduced without going through the ethics committee. Serious adverse events have to be reported. Progress and final reports have to be submitted to the ethics committee for evaluation related to the safety of participants and adherence to the protocol. At the same time, the Declaration of Helsinki 2013 version talks about vulnerability and how it can be addressed. What is the definition of vulnerability? There is the increased likelihood of being wrong or incurring additional harm when patients are recruited into clinical trials. Suppose the drug did not work and it led to exacerbation of disease. How are you going to treat them? Vulnerable subjects are those that cannot consent for themselves. They are also cognitively impaired and therefore they need to receive specific protection. And you must justify that you are doing this research involving vulnerable participants because it cannot be done with less vulnerable groups. For example, you're doing a study about cancer or about tuberculosis, and you are recruiting those that would have undergone resistance to treatment. No? And you are trying a new drug because it might benefit them. So it has to be justified why you are using those that are resistant to a specific drug. The research must be responsive to their health needs and they must benefit from the knowledge, the practice, and intervention that's being done and that will be seen in the research results. The next point is about informed consent. No? Informed consent is given by the patient or participant himself or herself, but if they wish to consult with family members or community leaders, they may do so, provided that the informed consent document is signed by the patient or participant, not by the husband, not by the tribal leader. The informed consent must contain adequate information about the research protocol. You tell them, no, you will have a blood draw and it can make you dizzy. No? The side effect of this drug is you're going to vomit. No? So these things must be found in the informed consent that would speak about the potential risk and the anticipated benefit. What's the anticipated benefit? No? It might be useful to you. It might benefit you and might treat you. So that's an anticipated benefit. What is the compensation for the harm caused by the research? And therefore, in many of clinical trials done by the pharmaceutical industry, the compensation for harm is guaranteed through a liability insurance. Post-study provisions or post-trial access must be guaranteed. There has to be attention to specific information needs of subjects and mode of delivery to ensure understanding, meaning here that it has to be stated in a layperson's language, not in technical terms that's only understood by the researcher, but in a layperson's language so that the participant will know what are the different issues involved. And if the participant or patient is cognitively impaired, no, or they are minors, or they are elderly who are cognitively impaired, there has to be a provision for a legally acceptable representative who signs the informed consent for them. Another important document is the SIOM's guideline. They were formerly known as the International Ethical Guidelines for Medical Biomedical Research Involving Human Subjects, and created as early as 1993 by SIOMS, updated in 2002, and jointly sponsored by WHO and UNESCO. What are some of the provisions of the SIOM's International Ethical Guidelines? Later on, there was another version for epidemiological research that came out in 2009. No? The provisions are such that it would justify the need for research, and very important is the ethical justification and scientific validity. In other words, when you are doing research, your protocol must be scientifically sound and ethically justified. It also states that local ethics review must be done of externally sponsored research in accordance with local laws and regulations. So that if this is a pharmaceutical sponsor abroad like Pfizer or Novartis, when it is going to be done in the Philippines, there has to be local ethics review. It also gives guidance about community research and protection of vulnerable subjects, and it provides capacity building for ethical and scientific review. The SIOM's guidelines, the latest version of which is 2016, merge the biomedical and epidemiological guidelines, and it heightened the emphasis on the importance of translational research. What's meant by translational research? Meaning, research must be applied, not just creating theories and hypotheses, but they must be applied in order to benefit human participants. Also, it says there's need to clarify what counts as fair research in low resource setting, like the Philippines, no? Where pharmaceutical research is supposed to contribute to capacity building. It would emphasize community engagement in research, community capacity building, and an awareness that the exclusion of potentially vulnerable groups in many cases has resulted in poor evidence. What does that mean? For example, women during the earlier period were excluded from research because they get pregnant. But now we realize that the data about men is going to be different from the data about women. And therefore, you need to include both so that you understand what would be the effective treatments for women as different from men. And there is an increase in big data research, meaning here these are researches that are global in nature. In phase 3 pharmaceutical research, we find out that this research is being done simultaneously in different countries, so that if you are to participate in a Novartis study, chances are this research is also being done in other parts of the world. In FERCAP, I would see clinical trials by pharmaceutical industry or sponsors being done simultaneously in Thailand, in the Philippines, in China, and Korea. And therefore, we need to understand how to harmonize our procedures. And that framework, of course, is about ICH GCP. So, in SIOMS, there has to be ethical justification for undertaking health related research involving humans. They must have scientific and social value. Social value is about the importance of the research. Scientific value is about scientific design. The prospect of generating the knowledge and the means necessary to promote and protect people's health. That's the ethical principle. Ensure that all research is carried out in ways that uphold human rights and respect, protect, and are fair to study participants and communities in which the research is undertaken. And that is the joint responsibility of the sponsor, of the investigator, and of the Ethics Committee. And finally, the ethical challenge is that the universal nature of the guidelines is challenged by specific requirements in local contexts and specific researches. Many of these protocols have been done and have been designed abroad in a sponsor initiated protocol. It is the sponsor that prepares the protocol for global application. And therefore, the job of the ethics committee is to find out the best way of adapting this protocol into the local context. So, standards in the form of guidelines contribute to having an ethical framework in the conduct of research across countries. These are multi country researches that would have to adjust to local context. And it is the duty of the investigator to make adjustments so that the needs of the local patients will be met. And it is also the duty of the local ethics committee to ensure that this happens. So, thank you for your attention, and we hope that I have given you useful information.